Welcome to the Bloodstain on Regent Street. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know, from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Hashtag Chapter 1, The Stain on the Pavement. It was on a bitter evening in February, the 11th as I find it recorded in my notes, that the affair of the Bloodstain on Regent Street first presented itself to us, and with it, one of the most singular and melancholy cases of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The day had been grey and lifeless, the kind of London winter's day that begins in dusk and merely darkens. By late afternoon a fog had crept in from the river, not the yellow, sulphurous variety that chokes and blinds, but a cold, white fog that muffled the city like cotton wool pressed against the ears. It swallowed the gas lamps whole and reduced the cabs on Baker Street to dim, lumbering shapes whose lanterns floated past our windows like the eyes of deep-sea creatures. Holmes had been in foul temper for the better part of a week. No case of any interest had crossed our threshold. He had spent the morning firing his revolver into the wall, an exercise I had long ceased to protest, knowing that the plaster would suffer whether I objected or not, and the afternoon conducting a series of experiments upon tobacco ash which, he claimed, I should allow him to distinguish the residue of 47 distinct varieties of pipe tobacco by colour alone. I confess I had dozed off during the 32nd. "You are a wonderful audience, Watson," he said, without looking up from his microscope. "Your snoring provides a rhythm by which I can time the combustion." "I was not snoring," I replied, straightening in my chair. "I was considering your findings with my eyes closed." He gave one of his thin, sharp smiles, the kind that appeared and vanished like a match struck in a draught, and returned to his slides. I took up the evening paper and tried to interest myself in the parliamentary debates, but the prose was as dense as the fog outside, and I had just resolved to ring for Mrs. Hudson and request tea when the bell sounded below. Holmes raised his head. His nostrils flared slightly, a small but telling sign of animation that I had learned to recognize over many years. "A visitor," he said, "a policeman, by the weight of the tread, and an agitated one. He has come up the stairs 2 at a time, which suggests either urgency or indigestion. Given the hour, I favour urgency." The door opened, and Inspector Lestrade entered. His lean, ferret-like face was flushed with cold, and his overcoat carried the smell of the fog, damp wool and coal smoke, and something underneath it, something faintly metallic that I could not immediately place. He did not remove his hat. "Mr. Holmes," he said, without preamble, "I need you on Regent Street. A man has been stabbed to death in a shop doorway, and I cannot make head nor tail of it." Holmes set down his pipette. "A stabbing on Regent Street is unfortunate, Lestrade, but hardly inexplicable. London produces several per week." "This one is?" Lestrade's voice carried a note I had seldom heard from him. Not frustration, which was his customary state, but something closer to bewilderment. "The man is Sir Edmund Hale, retired High Court judge, 67 years of age, well-known, well-connected. He was found at 5:30 this evening, slumped in the doorway of a milliner's shop near the Beak Street corner, stabbed once through the heart, dead when the constable arrived." Holmes's eyes had sharpened. "Go on." "The street was full of people, Mr. Holmes. Full. The evening traffic was at its peak. Pedestrians, cabs, carriages, street sellers. The fog was thick, I grant you. But there were dozens of people within 30 yards, and not one of them saw a thing. No struggle, no cry, no commotion of any kind. A passing couple found him already collapsed, and the woman screamed, and that was the first anyone knew of it." Lestrade removed his hat and turned it in his hands, a nervous habit. "It's as if the fog itself killed him, Mr. Holmes." Holmes was already on his feet. He seized his coat from the hook and his hat from the table and wound his scarf about his throat, with the decisive energy that always attended the opening of a new inquiry. "Come, Watson," he said, "bring your revolver, not because I expect to need it, but because you are a steadier companion when you have it in your pocket." I fetched the weapon from my desk drawer and followed him down the stairs. Lestrade had a cab waiting, and we climbed in together. Holmes, myself, and the inspector, and rattled south through streets that had been rendered nearly featureless by the fog. The gas lamps appeared and receded like a chain of dim pearls. Occasionally a pedestrian loomed out of the whiteness, startled by the clatter of hooves, and fell behind again. Holmes said nothing during the journey. He sat with his chin upon his chest and his fingers steepled before him. And I knew better than to intrude upon whatever silent machinery was already turning behind those keen grey eyes. We reached Regent Street to find a small crowd of constables and onlookers gathered near the shuttered frontage of a milliner's shop. A police lantern had been erected, casting a hard yellow circle on the pavement. The body had been removed, taken to the police mortuary, Lestrade explained, but the evidence of its presence remained. The bloodstain. It was longer than I had expected, a dark, irregular smear stretching roughly 5 feet along the wet flagstones, beginning near the curb and ending at the shop doorway where the dead man had come to rest. The blood had mixed with the evening's moisture, spreading in places to the width of a man's hand, and its colour in the lantern light was not the bright red of a fresh wound, but the deep, almost black hue of blood that has been exposed to cold air and rain. It was a terrible signature. That stain, the last staggering record of a man's final steps. Holmes dropped to one knee beside the beginning of the trail, the eastern end, nearest the curb, and produced his magnifying lens. He examined the flagstones with a minute, unhurried attention that was his hallmark, moving his lens slowly across the surface while Lestrade and I stood in silence. Twice he paused, leaning closer. Once he pressed his fingertip to the stone and examined it. "The blood trail runs east to west," he murmured. "He was struck somewhere near this point and staggered toward the shop door, where he fell." He looked up at Lestrade. "In which direction was Sir Edmund walking?" "West to east," said Lestrade. "He was coming from his club, the Athenaeum, and walking toward Beak Street, where his carriage was to meet him." "Then he turned," said Holmes. "After the blow, he did not continue forward. He turned and staggered back the way he had come, and to the left." He stood, his gaze tracing the line of the stain, his expression distant and precise. A man who is struck from his right side will instinctively flinch and turn to the left, away from the source of the pain. The direction of this trail tells us the attacker was on his right. "You can deduce the attacker's position from a blood stain?" Lestrade asked, with the particular mixture of scepticism and reluctant respect that he habitually directed at Holmes. "I can deduce that the victim turned leftward after receiving a wound to his left side, which is consistent with a blow delivered from the right. It is elementary physiology, Lestrade, nothing more." At that moment, a figure emerged from the fog and approached our circle of lamplight with the uncertain step of a man who has been waiting but dreading the summons. He was of medium height and slender build, somewhere in his early 40s, with neat dark hair silvered at the temples and a pale, drawn face that bore the unmistakable marks of recent shock. His overcoat was of good quality, his gloves were spotless, and he carried a handsome Malacca walking stick with a silver-banded handle. His eyes were red-rimmed. "This is Mr. Leonard Cray," said Lestrade, "Sir Edmund's private secretary. He was with the deceased earlier this evening." Cray inclined his head. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am grateful you have come." His voice was quiet, controlled, and carried the faintest tremor, the kind a man produces when he is holding himself together by conscious effort. Sir Edmund he was more than an employer to me. He was a great man. I cannot comprehend that anyone would... He stopped, pressed his lips together and looked away. Holmes studied him for a long moment, saying nothing. Then, "You were with Sir Edmund this evening, Mr. Cray. Tell me the sequence of events, if you would." Cray composed himself. "It was our daily routine. Sir Edmund spent his afternoons at the Athenaeum. I met him there at 4:45, as I always do, and we set off on foot toward Beak Street, where his carriage waits. He preferred to walk, said it sharpened his mind." "And your route?" "South, along Regent Street. Always the same. We had done it 1,000 times." "At what point did you part from Sir Edmund?" "At the corner of Regent Street and Beak Street. I went ahead to signal the coachman. The fog was very thick, and I was afraid the carriage might have moved to avoid the congestion. Sir Edmund walked on alone. It could not have been more than a minute, perhaps 2, before I heard a woman scream. I came running back and found—" His voice faltered. "I found him in the doorway. There was blood on his coat. His eyes were open. I knew at once." He bowed his head. In the lantern light, I could see his knuckles white upon the handle of his walking stick. "I should never have left his side," he said. Holmes let the silence hold for a moment. Then he asked, in a tone of casual interest that I recognized as carefully calibrated, "Which side of Sir Edmund did you customarily walk on, Mr. Cray?" Cray looked up. "His right side, always. Yes, Sir Edmund was somewhat deaf in his right ear, an old complaint, and he preferred me on that side so that he need not strain to hear me when I spoke." "Thank you," said Holmes. "That is all for now." Cray nodded, murmured his willingness to assist in any way, and withdrew into the fog. I watched Holmes as he turned back to the Bloodstain. His expression had changed, subtly, but I knew him well enough to see it. The restless irritation of the past week had gone. In its place was something harder and more luminous, the focused intensity that came upon him only when a puzzle had seized his imagination. He crouched once more over the flagstones, examining the eastern end of the blood trail, the point of origin, with renewed attention. He spent several minutes there, moving his lens in slow, methodical arcs, while Lestrade shifted his weight from foot to foot, and the fog drifted through the lantern light like smoke. At last, Holmes stood. He folded his lens and placed it in his pocket. "Come, Watson," he said. "The fog is telling us something, and I mean to listen." We left Lestrade with his constables and walked north through the muffled streets. Holmes was silent for some time, his hands thrust into his pockets, his breath making brief ghosts in the cold air. I kept pace beside him and waited, knowing that when he was ready, he would speak. "A man stabbed through the heart on one of the busiest streets in London," he said at last, "and no one saw the blade. The fog conceals much, Watson, but it does not conceal a knife thrust, not unless the victim himself did not know he had been struck." "How is that possible?" "It is not merely possible. It is the only explanation consistent with the facts. Sir Edmund did not cry out. He did not struggle. He walked several paces after receiving the wound. He believed, I think, that he had suffered a sudden pain, a stitch, a cramp, the protests of an aging body in winter cold. It was only when the internal bleeding overwhelmed him that he fell. Then the weapon was narrow, very narrow, and the thrust was delivered with extraordinary precision, through layers of winter clothing, by someone who knew exactly where to find the heart." He paused at a crossing and looked back toward Regent Street, though nothing was visible through the fog but the faint aureole of the police lantern. "Someone who was close to him, Watson. Close enough to touch." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. "His secretary walks on his right side," I said. "And you said the attacker was on the right." Holmes glanced at me. "I said the evidence is consistent with an attacker on the right. That is not the same thing, not yet. But it is the thread I intend to follow." We walked on in silence. The fog closed around us, and the gaslight of Regent Street faded behind us like a memory. Chapter 2, The Judge's Last Evening. We returned to Baker Street late that evening, and Holmes did not speak again until we were settled before the fire with whisky and water. Mrs. Hudson had left a cold supper on the sideboard, but neither of us touched it. The fog had followed us indoors. Oh, so it seemed. The room felt close and watchful, as if the night itself were waiting for something. Holmes filled his pipe and lit it with a coal from the grate. He smoked in silence for several minutes, his long legs stretched toward the fire, his gaze fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. I had seen this posture 100 times. It was the attitude of a man assembling facts the way a watchmaker assembles gears, each piece examined, turned, and placed with care before the next was considered. "Watson," he said at last, "what did you make of Mr. Cray?" "A man in genuine distress," I said. His grief appeared sincere, the tremor in his voice, the pallor, the reddened eyes. These are difficult to counterfeit. "Difficult," said Holmes, "not impossible. But let us set aside the question of sincerity for the moment, and consider instead the question of opportunity." He drew on his pipe, and exhaled a thin stream of smoke that curled toward the ceiling like a question mark. "Cray walks at Sir Edmund's right side. He has done so, by his own account, 1,000 times. He knows the route, he knows the hour, he knows the old man's habits, his deafness, the thickness of his winter coat. And on this particular evening, at this particular moment, he leaves Sir Edmund's side, for the first time, we must assume, in the course of their daily walk, to signal a coachman." "You suspect him, then?" "I suspect everyone, Watson. It is an occupational habit. But I will tell you what troubles me more than Cray's proximity." He leaned forward, his elbows upon his knees, and fixed me with those sharp, luminous eyes. "It is the weapon. A blade narrow enough to pass between the ribs and pierce the heart, without the victim immediately recognizing the wound. That is not a common knife. That is not a kitchen blade or a clasp knife or a ruffian's stiletto snatched from a pawn shop. That is something designed for precisely this purpose, or repurposed with considerable knowledge. A surgical instrument? Possibly. Or something older. A hat pin of unusual length, a shoemaker's awl. A blade concealed within an ordinary object." He paused. "A walking stick, for instance." The words fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. I thought at once of Cray's handsome Malacca cane with its silver-banded handle. "You noticed the stick," I said. "I noticed everything about Mr. Cray, Watson, as I notice everything about every person who presents themselves before me in connection with a violent death. The stick was of particular interest because it was the only object upon his person that might conceal a blade. But I did not examine it, and I will not accuse a man on the basis of a possibility. We need facts, and we shall begin gathering them tomorrow morning at the police mortuary." He knocked his pipe out against the grate and rose. "I shall also require a list of Sir Edmund's recent cases, those he adjudicated in the final years of his tenure. A High Court judge accumulates enemies the way a ship accumulates barnacles, Watson. Some of them are more dangerous than others." The mortuary was a grim, low-ceilinged room in a building off the Marylebone Road, lit by gas jets that gave the tiled walls a greenish, aquatic pallor. The air smelled of carbolic acid, and something older and less conquerable beneath it. I had spent enough time in such places during my medical career that the smell no longer disturbed me, but it never became welcome. Sir Edmund Hale lay upon the examination table beneath a linen sheet. The police surgeon, Dr. Phelps, a compact businesslike man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers, had completed his preliminary examination and was writing his notes when we arrived. Lestrade was already present, standing at a respectful distance from the body with his hands clasped behind his back and the expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. "Gentlemen," said Dr. Phelps, setting down his pen, "I can tell you what killed him, though I confess I cannot tell you how it was done so neatly." Holmes crossed to the table and drew back the sheet without ceremony. Sir Edmund Hale had been a large man, broad in the chest and heavy in the shoulders, with a face that, even in the grey stillness of death, retained the stern authority of a man accustomed to passing judgment. His white hair was thick and combed straight back from a high forehead. His hands, folded upon his chest, were large and well kept, with the blunt, strong fingers of a man who had once been physical. There was a quiet dignity about him, even here, even now, and I felt a pang of something that was not quite sorrow but was adjacent to it. The recognition that this had been a man of substance, reduced in an instant to evidence. The wound was on the left side of the chest, between the 4th and 5th ribs. As it was remarkably small, no more than half an inch in width, and its edges were clean and precise, without the ragged tearing that a broader blade would produce. There was very little external blood. The damage had been internal. "Single puncture wound," said Dr. Phelps, "penetrated the left ventricle. Death would have followed within 2 to 4 minutes. Rapid internal hemorrhage. The blade entered at a slight upward angle, which tells me either the attacker was shorter than the victim or struck from a crouch position. Sir Edmund was 6 feet and 1 inch. The blade itself..." He paused and adjusted his spectacles. "I have never seen a wound quite like it, Mr. Holmes. The penetration channel is very narrow, approximately 3/16 of an inch, and extraordinarily clean. No serration, no lateral tearing. Whatever the weapon was, it was not a conventional knife." Holmes bent over the wound with his lens. He examined it for a long time, turning his head at various angles, occasionally requesting that the gas jet be brought closer. Dr. Phelps complied with the patience of a man who understood that Holmes's methods, however peculiar, tended to produce results. "The depth of penetration?" Holmes asked. "Approximately 4.5 inches. And the angle, you said upward. How steep?" "Perhaps 15 degrees from horizontal." Holmes straightened. His face was unreadable. "A narrow instrument, 4.5 inches in length, inserted with a single thrust through winter clothing. An overcoat, a suit jacket, a waistcoat, and a shirt, without the victim immediately recognizing the nature of the injury. That requires not merely a sharp blade, Doctor, but extraordinary force applied with extraordinary precision. This was not a chance blow struck in passing." "I agree entirely," said Dr. Phelps. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Sir Edmund's clothing, where is it?" Lestrade gestured to a side table where the dead man's garments had been laid out in order. Holmes crossed to them and examined each piece in turn, beginning with the overcoat. It was a heavy wool garment of excellent quality, dark grey, and Holmes found the puncture in the left breast almost immediately, a tiny hole, barely visible, that one might have mistaken for a moth bite. He examined the corresponding holes in the jacket, the waistcoat, and the shirt, holding each garment up to the light. "Notice, Watson," he said, beckoning me closer. "The fibres around each puncture are pushed inward, confirming a single entry without withdrawal and re-entry. But look at the overcoat, here, around the hole." He held the lens for me. "Do you see the faint circular impression in the wool? A ring of compression approximately 1 inch in diameter, surrounding the puncture." I looked. He was right. There was a subtle flattening of the wool fibres in a circle around the tiny hole, as though something round and flat had been pressed firmly against the fabric at the moment of penetration. "A guard," I said. "Like the guard on a blade. Something to prevent the weapon from entering too deeply." "Or to provide leverage for the thrust," said Holmes. "A disc or washer fixed upon the blade at a specific depth, ensuring that exactly 4.5 inches, and no more, entered the body. This weapon was calibrated, Watson. It was built to kill in precisely this manner." Lestrade had come closer, his scepticism visibly struggling with his curiosity. "Built? You're saying someone constructed a weapon specifically to kill Sir Edmund Hale?" "I am saying that the evidence points to a weapon of unusual design, employed with unusual skill against a specific target in a carefully chosen setting. The fog, the crowded street, the routine walk, the momentary absence of the one person who might have seen the blow. None of this is coincidence, Lestrade. This is architecture. The word hung in the cold air of the mortuary. Architecture. It was the word Holmes used when he recognized the hand of intelligence behind a crime. Not impulse, not passion, but design. He turned back to the clothing and continued his examination in silence. I watched him work through the pockets of Sir Edmund's overcoat and jacket, a leather wallet containing £7 and a few shillings, a gold pocket watch with a chain, a pair of reading spectacles in a case, a handkerchief, and a small folded piece of paper. Holmes unfolded it with care. It was a note, handwritten in a neat, compact script on plain stationery, undated and unsigned. The matter we discussed cannot wait. I must see you privately. The usual place. A Thursday at 6. Holmes read it twice, turned it over, held it to the light, and then passed it to Lestrade without comment. Found in his inner breast pocket, said Lestrade. We don't know who wrote it. No envelope, no postmark. Thursday, said Holmes. Sir Edmund was killed on a Tuesday. Either the appointment had already taken place, or it had not yet arrived. In either case, someone wished to meet him privately and urgently, and did not wish to be identified. He took the note back from Lestrade and folded it into his own pocket. I shall need to examine this further. The paper stock and the ink may tell us something the words do not. We left the mortuary shortly after. The morning was cold and bright. The fog had lifted during the night, and London had that scrubbed, startled look it sometimes wears after a day of poor visibility, as though the city were surprised to find itself still standing. Holmes walked with his usual long, rapid stride, his coat-tails flapping behind him, his mind clearly racing ahead of his feet. 2 lines of inquiry, Watson, he said as we turned onto Baker Street. The weapon and the note. The weapon will tell us how this crime was committed. The note may tell us why, and between the how and the why, we shall find our murderer, or our murderers, as the case may be. You think there may be more than one? I think that a crime of this precision suggests planning, and planning suggests resources, and resources suggest either wealth or collaboration. Sir Edmund Hale sat in judgment over some of the most dangerous men in England. We must discover which of them had the means, the motive, and the particular kind of cold patience required to engineer a death like this. He paused at our door and looked up at the bright winter sky with an expression that was almost one of pleasure. It is a 3-pipe problem at the very least, Watson. Perhaps 4. I shall not require lunch. Chapter 3. The Judge's Enemies. The Hale residence stood in a quiet square off Park Lane, a handsome Georgian townhouse of white stone, 4 stories high, with black iron railings and windows that looked out upon the bare winter trees, with an expression of settled, prosperous indifference. It was the house of a man who had done well in the world, and saw no reason to apologize for it. A footman admitted us, and led us through a marble-floored entrance hall to a drawing-room on the 1st floor. The room was tastefully appointed. Silk wallpaper in a shade of deep blue, paintings of pastoral scenes in gilded frames, a marble fireplace in which a coal fire burned steadily, but there was a curious emptiness to it, as though the furnishings had been selected to fill space, rather than to express anything of the people who lived among them. Lady Catherine Hale received us standing. She was younger than I had expected, no more than 32 or 33, and strikingly handsome, with dark hair arranged in a fashionable style, and a pale, composed face that gave nothing away. She wore black silk, but wore it as though it were merely the colour of the season rather than the uniform of grief. Her eyes, which were large and brown and very steady, moved between Holmes and myself, with the careful appraisal of a woman accustomed to being observed and determined to control what was seen. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. Her voice was measured, low, pleasant. "I am told you are the best. I hope that is true. My husband deserves justice, whatever our private difficulties may have been." It was a remarkable opening, the acknowledgment of marital unhappiness delivered as casually as a remark about the weather. Holmes inclined his head but offered no comment. He asked instead whether Sir Edmund had spoken of any recent threats or anxieties. "Edmund had many enemies," Lady Catherine said, seating herself in a chair by the fire and gesturing for us to sit. 30 years on the bench produces them as surely as autumn produces dead leaves. He received threatening letters. I believe Inspector Lestrade knows of these. He took them seriously enough to mention them to me, though he affected not to be troubled." "Did he name anyone specifically?" "He mentioned a disbarred barrister, a Mr. Price, I believe, who had been making a nuisance of himself, and he spoke once or twice of former defendants, men he had sentenced, who might bear grudges. But Edmund was not a fearful man, Mr. Holmes. He had spent his life sitting in judgment over violent people and believed himself above their reach." A thin, precise smile crossed her lips. "He was wrong, it would seem." Holmes asked to see Sir Edmund's study. Lady Catherine hesitated, a fractional pause quickly concealed, and then rang the bell. Cray appeared within moments, as though he had been waiting just beyond the door, and escorted us down the corridor. The study was a large, book-lined room at the rear of the house, overlooking a small walled garden. It smelled of leather and old paper, and the ghost of cigar smoke. The desk was massive, mahogany, inlaid with green leather, and upon it lay the orderly evidence of a methodical mind. Correspondence filed in labelled trays, a blotter, an inkwell, a calendar turned to the date of the murder. Holmes moved through the room with the quiet, unhurried attention of a man reading a text written in a language only he could speak. He examined the bookshelves, rows of legal volumes, Blackstone and Chitty, and Hale's own collected judgments, and then paused before a lower shelf upon which a series of leather-bound notebooks stood in a neat row. They were uniform in size and binding, each stamped with a year in gilt upon the spine, spanning 3 decades of judicial service. Holmes ran his finger along them. He said nothing, but I noticed his finger pause at one point, a gap in the sequence barely the width of a single volume, before moving on. He made no remark about it, and I thought at the time that I had imagined the hesitation. We spoke briefly with the household staff. Lady Catherine's maid, a thin, sharp-featured woman named Dorset, confirmed with fierce loyalty that her mistress had been at home the entire evening of the murder. Lady Catherine did not leave the house, sir. I was with her from 4 o'clock until she retired. I would swear it on any Bible you put before me. The declaration had the rehearsed quality of a speech prepared in advance, though whether this reflected conspiracy or merely the defensive instincts of a devoted servant I could not determine. A footman named Briggs offered a different kind of testimony. When Holmes asked about Cray, the man's face softened with something like admiration. "Mr. Cray is the finest secretary a gentleman could wish for, sir. Never a harsh word, never a complaint. He was Sir Edmund's shadow, always at his side, always attending to his needs. I've been in this house 11 years, and I've never known a more devoted servant." Holmes thanked him, and we departed. Our next visit was to Scotland Yard, where Lestrade had news. The handwriting on the threatening letters had been examined by a graphologist, and a match had been found. The letters were written by one Gordon Price, a former barrister whom Sir Edmund had reported to the Bar Council 20 years earlier for misappropriation of client funds. Price had been disbarred, his career destroyed, and he had spent the intervening decades in a slow, bitter decline. He was known to drink, known to rage publicly against Sir Edmund, and had been seen on Regent Street on the evening of the murder by 2 separate witnesses. That's our man," said Lestrade with satisfaction. "Motive, opportunity, and his handwriting on the threats. I'll have him in irons by tea-time." Holmes said nothing to discourage this, but as we left the yard he murmured to me, "Lestrade is building his case upon sand, Watson. The man who announces his intention to kill is rarely the man who does it. Threatening letters are the refuge of cowards. They are a substitute for action, not a prelude to it. You do not think Price is the killer. I think Price is a drunkard and a bully and a man consumed by grievance. Whether he is also a murderer is a different question entirely. We found Price in lodgings near Chancery Lane, 2 cramped rooms above a stationer's shop, reeking of stale tobacco and spilled gin. He was a large man gone to ruin, with a florid face, bloodshot eyes, and hands that trembled when they were not wrapped around a glass. He met us with open hostility. "More questions," he spat, dropping into a sagging armchair. "I've already told your inspector everything I know, which is nothing. I didn't kill Edmund Hale, though God knows I've dreamed of it often enough." "You wrote him threatening letters," said Holmes. "I wrote him the truth. I told him what he was, a hypocrite and a destroyer of men. He ruined me over a trifle, Mr. Holmes. A temporary borrowing of funds. Every barrister in London has done the same, and he reported me as though I were a common thief. 20 years I've been paying for his righteousness." "Where were you at 5:30 on Tuesday evening?" Price's jaw tightened. "Walking. On Regent Street, since you'll hear it from others anyway. I was in the area. I'm often in the area." "It doesn't mean I killed anyone." "What were you doing on Regent Street?" "Minding my own damn business." He poured himself a measure of gin with shaking hands. "I had an errand, a private errand. That's all I'll say." Holmes watched him drink and said nothing more. We left shortly after, descending the narrow stairs into the cold afternoon light. Holmes walked in silence for half a block before speaking. "He has the hatred, Watson. He has nursed it for 20 years. And it has curdled into something very close to madness. But look at his hands." He held up his own, steady as stone. "A man who cannot pour a glass of gin without trembling did not drive a needle-thin blade between a man's ribs with surgical precision. Price could no more have delivered that wound than he could have threaded a needle in a hurricane." "Then who?" Holmes did not answer, but as we walked back toward Baker Street, I noticed that his pace had quickened and his expression had taken on the concentrated intensity that always preceded a turn in his thinking, a door opening in his mind that had been closed a moment before. "The quiet ones, Watson," he said at last, almost to himself. "It is always the quiet ones." Chapter 4. The captain and the widow Holmes dispatched me the following morning with instructions that were, by his standards, unusually specific. "I require you to become a gossip. Watson," he said over breakfast, "Lady Catherine Hale is a young, handsome, recently widowed woman who married a man 35 years her senior. Society will have formed opinions about her, and society's opinions, however unreliable in matters of fact, are invaluable in matters of character. Go to your club, speak to your friends, speak to their wives, if you can manage it, without arousing suspicion. I want to know who Lady Catherine sees, where she goes, and whether her grief is as well tailored as her mourning dress. And what will you be doing?" "I shall be visiting a solicitor." He offered no further explanation, and I knew better than to press him. I spent the better part of the day in gentle, circuitous inquiry. My old friend Thurston, who moved in circles adjacent to the Hale household, proved a willing source. Over billiards at the club, he mentioned, with the studied casualness of a man who enjoys passing along what he has heard, that Lady Catherine had been seen frequently in the company of a Captain Reginald Thorpe of the Royal Fusiliers. "Dashing fellow," Thurston said, chalking his cue. "Decorated in Afghanistan. Very popular with the ladies, very popular with Lady Catherine in particular, if one believes the whispers." "And does one?" "One has no direct evidence, old man. But where there is that much smoke, one generally finds a fire, or, at the very least, 2 people standing rather close to a candle." I pressed further, as delicately as I could, and learned that Thorpe was known to be in financial difficulty. His family money was gone, spent, Thurston believed, on horses and cards, and he survived on his officers' half pay and the generosity of friends. The generosity, it was implied, was wearing thin. Through the wife of another acquaintance I obtained a more pointed piece of intelligence. A Lady Catherine and Captain Thorpe had been observed together at a private supper only 10 days before Sir Edmund's death, and their manner toward each other had been, in the informant's careful phrase, warmer than mere friendship would explain. I reported all of this to Holmes that evening at Baker Street. He listened without interruption, his fingers steepled, his pipe sending a thin column of smoke toward the ceiling. "Good," he said, when I had finished. "Now hear what I have learned." He had visited the offices of Messrs. Cathcart and Poole, solicitors, in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Sir Edmund had consulted them 6 weeks before his death regarding an amendment to his will. The solicitor, bound by professional confidence but loosened, Holmes implied, by the gravity of a murder investigation and the persuasive force of Holmes's manner, confirmed that Sir Edmund had wished to reduce Lady Catherine's inheritance substantially. The current will left her the Mayfair house and approximately £40,000. The proposed amendment would have reduced this to the house alone, with the bulk of the estate redirected to a charitable trust in Sir Edmund's name. The reason, I asked. The solicitor would not say explicitly, but his silences were eloquent. Sir Edmund suspected his wife of infidelity. He had no proof, or none he shared with his solicitor. But his instructions were clear, and his tone, apparently, was that of a man who had arrived at a painful conclusion and wished to act upon it before his resolve weakened. And the amendment was never executed? Sir Edmund died before it could be finalised. Under the existing will, Lady Catherine inherits everything. The implications were obvious. Lady Catherine had motive, £40,000 and freedom from an unhappy marriage, and Captain Thorpe had motive of his own, for if Lady Catherine became a wealthy widow, his financial troubles might be solved in the most agreeable possible manner. Together they formed a partnership of mutual convenience that pointed unmistakably toward the doorway on Regent Street. "We must speak to Thorpe," I said. "I've already arranged it. Tomorrow at the Army and Navy Club." The Army and Navy Club occupied a handsome building on Pall Mall, and its interior had the particular atmosphere common to all gentlemen's clubs. A mixture of leather, tobacco, and the quiet self-satisfaction of men who believe they have earned the right to sit in comfortable chairs and read newspapers without interruption. Captain Reginald Thorpe met us in a private sitting-room off the main lounge. He was exactly as Thurston had described, dashing in the way that certain military men are dashing, with an erect bearing, a strong jaw, a neat dark moustache, and the easy, confident manner of a man who has faced worse dangers than a detective's questions and emerged with his reputation intact. He wore his civilian clothes with the precision of a man accustomed to uniform. His handshake was firm, his smile was ready, and his eyes, which were blue and clear and held mine a fraction longer than was strictly necessary, had the practised warmth of a man who understood the value of first impressions. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, a terrible business about Sir Edmund. I knew him only slightly through social occasions, but he struck me as a man of great integrity. Lady Catherine must be devastated. Holmes let this pass without comment. He began with neutral questions. How long Thorpe had known the Hale family, in what capacity, through which social connections, and Thorpe answered readily, offering nothing that was not already public knowledge. He was smooth, I thought. Too smooth. His answers had the polished quality of responses prepared in advance, as each one delivered with just the right measure of concern and cooperativeness. Holmes shifted ground. "You were here at the club on the evening of the murder, Captain?" "I was. Signed in at 5:15, signed out at 7:45. The porter will confirm it." "And you remained in the club throughout that period?" There it was, the hesitation. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, a fractional tightening around the eyes, a minute adjustment of his posture in the chair. But I saw it, and I knew Holmes saw it. "I did," said Thorpe. "I dined in the members' dining room and spent the evening reading in the library." Holmes nodded pleasantly and moved on to other matters. He asked about Sir Edmund's reputation, about Lady Catherine's state of mind, about the general tenor of the Hale household. Thorpe answered everything with the same easy fluency, and we departed shortly after with handshakes and expressions of mutual goodwill. Outside, in the cold afternoon air of Pall Mall, Holmes was silent for a full minute before he spoke. "He is lying, Watson." "The hesitation," I said. "The hesitation, yes, but more than that. I spoke with a club porter before our interview. There is a back passage, a service corridor, that connects the ground floor to a rear exit on a side street. Members use it occasionally to avoid the main entrance when they wish to come and go without being noted. The porter cannot confirm that Thorpe was in the club continuously between 5 and 8 o'clock. He can only confirm that Thorpe signed the book twice. Then Thorpe could have left during the critical window. He could, and the fact that he lied about it, calmly, directly to my face, suggests that wherever he went, he does not wish it known. Holmes thrust his hands into his pockets and began walking briskly eastward. "Consider the picture, Watson. A young wife in an unhappy marriage. A handsome officer in financial ruin. A husband about to disinherit the wife, and the officer absent from his club at the precise hour the husband is killed. It is damning." "It is convenient," said Holmes, "and I have learned to distrust convenience. The most obvious solution to a crime is often the correct one, but when the obvious solution arranges itself this neatly, when every piece falls into place without resistance, I find myself wondering whether I am looking at the truth or at a picture someone has painted for me to find." I considered this. "You think someone has arranged the evidence to implicate Thorpe?" "I think nothing yet. I observe, and I wait. But I will tell you this, Watson. The wound that killed Sir Edmund Hale was not the work of a soldier, and I've seen what soldiers do with blades. They slash, they thrust with force and fury. They aim for the throat, the belly, the great muscles of the arm. They do not thread a needle between the 4th and 5th ribs with the delicacy of a watchmaker inserting a spring. Whoever killed Sir Edmund had the hands of a craftsman, not a cavalryman." He paused at the corner and looked back toward the club, his expression thoughtful. "Tomorrow I shall return to Regent Street," he said. "There is something I overlooked, or rather, something I observed but did not yet understand. The pavement has more to tell us, Watson. Stone has a long memory." Chapter 5. The Scratch on the Stone. Holmes woke me before dawn the next morning, or rather, I woke to find him already dressed and standing at my bedroom door with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and an expression of focused impatience that told me argument would be futile. "The light, Watson," he said. I need the early light. The angle of the morning sun along Regent Street will illuminate the pavement in a way that the gas lamps could not. Dress warmly." I did as I was told, and within 20 minutes we were in a cab rattling through streets that were still grey and empty, the city not yet fully awake. The air was bitterly cold but clear. The fog had not returned, and by the time we reached Regent Street, the first pale light of a February morning was creeping along the facades of the shops, throwing long shadows across the flagstones. Holmes paid the cabman and stood for a moment in the centre of the pavement, looking south along the street as though reacquainting himself with an old friend. The bloodstain had been scrubbed away by now. The shop owner had seen to that. But Holmes was not interested in the stain. He walked directly to the eastern end of where it had been, the point of origin, where he had crouched with his lens on the night of the murder, and he knelt again upon the cold stone. He worked slowly. I stood at a respectful distance and watched him move his lens in a methodical pattern across the flagstones. Left to right, then forward 6 inches, then left to right again, covering the area with the systematic thoroughness of a farmer ploughing a field. Occasionally he stopped, lowered his face almost to the stone, and examined something with an intensity that shut out the world around him. Twice he produced a small folding ruler from his pocket and measured distances. Once he took out his penknife and scraped at a crevice between the stones, collecting a pinch of grit on the blade and transferring it to a small envelope. Pedestrians had begun to appear, early workers, delivery boys, a woman with a basket heading to market, and they gave the kneeling figure wide berth, in glancing at him with the mild curiosity Londoners reserve for behaviour that is eccentric but not threatening. I felt somewhat self-conscious, standing guard over a man who appeared to be having an intimate conversation with the pavement, but Holmes was oblivious to everything but the stone beneath his lens. After nearly 40 minutes he stood. His knees were damp and his trousers bore the grey dust of the flagstones, but his face held that particular expression, taut, bright, barely suppressed, that I'd come to recognise as the look of a man who has found what he was looking for. "Come here, Watson," he pointed downward. "Tell me what you see." I crouched beside him and looked where he indicated. At first I saw nothing but pavement, the ordinary, slightly uneven surface of a London flagstone, grey and worn. But then, as my eyes adjusted, and the low morning light raked across the stone at a shallow angle, I saw it. A small, sharp gouge in the surface, roughly circular, no wider than the tip of my little finger. The stone around it was freshly scored. The scratch was lighter in colour than the surrounding surface, meaning whatever had made it had cut through the accumulated grime of years to the clean stone beneath. "A mark," I said. Something struck the stone with considerable force. The edges are clean, not a hobnail, which would leave a rougher impression. "Excellent, Watson. What shape?" "Circular, perhaps 3/8 of an inch across." "And what common object, carried daily by gentlemen throughout London, terminates in a circular metal point of precisely that diameter?" I understood at once. A walking stick, the ferrule. The ferrule of a walking stick driven downward against the flagstone with force sufficient to gouge the surface. Not the casual tap of a stick set down in the ordinary course of walking. That would leave no mark at all on stone this hard. This was a deliberate, a forceful jab, a bracing action. Holmes straightened and looked at me. "Imagine, Watson, that you are holding a weapon in your right hand, a weapon that requires a firm thrust to deploy. You are walking beside your victim. You need stability, leverage, a fixed point from which to drive the blade home. What do? You jam the tip of your stick against the ground at the moment of the strike. The stick becomes your fulcrum." He mimed the action, the walking stick gripped in the right hand, the sharp downward jab of the ferrule, the simultaneous lateral thrust with a concealed blade. It was a single, fluid motion, and its efficiency was terrible. "Every lever needs a fulcrum," he said quietly, "and there it is, written in the stone." We breakfasted at a coffee-house near Piccadilly Circus, and I ate with more appetite than the circumstances perhaps warranted, while Holmes drank black coffee and turned an envelope of stone dust between his long fingers. "We shall visit the Hale residence again this morning," he said. "I need another look at Mr. Cray, and at his walking stick." "You intend to examine it?" "I intend to admire it. There is a difference, Watson, and it is the difference between alerting a suspect and observing one." We arrived at the house at 10:30 and were shown in by the same footman, Briggs, who informed us that Lady Catherine was indisposed, but that Mr. Cray was in the study attending to Sir Edmund's correspondence. Cray received us with his customary quiet courtesy, rising from the desk and offering chairs. He looked, I thought, somewhat thinner than when I had first seen him. The strain of the past days had drawn his features tighter, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. But his manner was composed, his speech careful and precise, and he answered Holmes's questions, which concerned minor details of Sir Edmund's daily schedule, with patient thoroughness. The walking stick stood in the corner of the room, leaning against the bookcase. Holmes let 20 minutes pass before he contrived his approach. He rose from his chair, apparently to examine a framed map of London that hung on the wall near the bookcase, and in doing so positioned himself within arm's reach of the stick. "A handsome cane, Mr. Cray," he remarked, as though the observation had just occurred to him. "Malacca, is it not? One sees very few of that quality." Cray glanced toward the stick. "Thank you, yes. It was a gift to myself some years ago. I am a great walker, Mr. Holmes, and a good stick is a companion on London streets. May I?" Holmes lifted the stick without waiting for permission, a small rudeness that he carried off as absent-minded curiosity. He turned it in his hands, running his fingers along the smooth, reddish-brown shaft, examining the silver band at the handle with apparent admiration. Then, casually, naturally, he tilted it to inspect the ferrule. I was watching Cray. His expression did not change, not precisely, but something shifted behind his eyes, a minute contraction of attention, as though a door inside him had closed very softly. He said nothing. He did not reach for the stick or ask Holmes to put it down. He simply waited, with the patience of a man who has been waiting for a very long time. Holmes returned the stick to its place with a smile. "Excellent craftsmanship. The ferrule is brass, I see, and well worn. You do walk a great deal." "All over London," said Cray. "The pavements take their toll on everything." "They do, indeed," said Holmes. We took our leave shortly after. In the cab, Holmes sat in silence for several minutes, his chin upon his breast, his eyes half closed. Then he spoke, and his voice carried a quality I had heard only rarely. Not excitement exactly, but the cold, steady focus of a man who has sighted his quarry across a wide field and is calculating the distance. "The ferrule is recently scratched, Watson. Not the general wear of years, but a fresh, deep scoring on one side, consistent with being driven against stone. And embedded in the scratches, visible under even casual inspection, there are traces of pale dust. The same pale dust that I collected this morning from the gouge in the Regent Street flagstone. You can match them? I can determine whether they are of the same geological composition. Regent Street is paved with Portland stone, a very specific oolitic limestone with a distinctive grain. If the dust in Cray's ferrule matches, we have placed his stick at the exact point where the murder was committed." He fell silent again. I could feel the shape of the case changing around us, the focus narrowing, the suspects shedding like dead leaves until only one figure remained, standing quietly at the centre of it all with a handsome walking stick and 13 years of patient, silent attendance. That afternoon brought a development from Lestrade. The inspector arrived at Baker Street in a state of barely contained triumph. Captain Thorpe's alibi had cracked. The club porter, upon further questioning, had confirmed that Thorpe was not seen in the dining room or the library during the critical period between 6 1/4 to 7. Thorpe had been confronted with this and, after considerable resistance, had admitted that he had left the club through the back passage. "He won't say where he went," said Lestrade, pacing before our fireplace. "Refused point blank. Says it's a private matter and has nothing to do with the murder. I'll have the truth out of him tomorrow, mister. Holmes, I'm bringing him to the yard." Holmes received this news with less enthusiasm than Lestrade expected. "Before you clap him in irons, Inspector, I would suggest you make inquiries among the moneylenders of Pall Mall and its immediate environs. Specifically, ask whether any of them received a visit from a military gentleman between 6 1/4 to 7 on the evening in question." Lestrade frowned. "Moneylenders? What has that to do with murder?" "Perhaps nothing, or perhaps everything, but a man who lies about his whereabouts is not necessarily concealing a crime. he may simply be concealing a humiliation. Lestrade departed, unconvinced but willing to follow Holmes's suggestion, a measure of the respect that years of collaboration had produced, however grudgingly. When he had gone, Holmes filled his pipe and stood at the window, looking down into Baker Street. "The net draws tighter, Watson," he said. "But we are still missing the thread that connects the man to the motive. Cray had proximity. The walking stick may give us the means. But why? Why would a man spend 13 years in devoted service to another and then kill him on a Tuesday evening in February?" "Perhaps the devotion was real," I offered. "Perhaps something changed." Holmes turned from the window. His gaze was sharp and searching, as though I had said something of greater significance than I realized. "Yes," he said slowly. Something changed. Something he discovered. Something that transformed long service into something else entirely. And I believe I know where he discovered it." He reached for his coat. "Tomorrow, Watson, we return to the study. There is a gap on a shelf that has been troubling me since our first visit, and I mean to find out what filled it. Chapter 6. The devoted servant. I have observed, over many years of partnership with Sherlock Holmes, that the turning point of an investigation rarely announces itself. There is no thunderclap, no sudden illumination. Instead, there is a quiet shift in his attention, a reorientation, like a compass needle swinging north, and the entire weight of his formidable intellect settles upon a single point that until that moment had seemed no more significant than any other. That shift occurred on the morning of Saturday, the 15th of February. Holmes had been awake for most of the night, and I found him at the breakfast table with 3 cups of cold coffee arranged before him, like chess pieces, and a drift of cigarette ash on the tablecloth that Mrs. Hudson would not forgive. And in his eyes was that hard, distant clarity that told me he had moved beyond speculation and into certainty, or something very near it. "Watson," he said without preamble, "I want you to go to Regent Street this morning and visit the tobacconist near the Beak Street corner. His name is Arnott. I want you to ask him, in your most genial and unthreatening manner, whether he had a customer in his back room on the evening of the 11th, specifically between 5:15 and 6 o'clock. You're thinking of Price. I am thinking of eliminating Price. Lestrade is still half convinced the threatening letters point to our killer, and I need that avenue closed before I can direct his attention where it belongs. Price claims he was on Regent Street for a private errand. Arnott's tobacconist is the kind of establishment where a man with poor credit and expensive tastes might spend an hour haggling over a box of cigars. Go and charm the truth out of him, Watson. You have a gift for making shopkeepers feel they are helping rather than informing. And you? I shall be at Somerset House. He stood, brushing ash from his waistcoat. There is a gap in the historical record that I mean to fill. I will recount my own errand briefly, and if it proves straightforward. The tobacconist, Arnott, was a stout, worried-looking man who operated a small but well-stocked shop on a side street just off Regent Street proper. He was reluctant at first. He had heard of the murder, of course, and wanted no involvement, but I assured him that his testimony might help to clear an innocent man rather than condemn a guilty one, and this, combined with what I hope was an air of trustworthy sympathy, persuaded him to speak. Yes, he confirmed. Mr. Price had been in the back room of his shop on the evening in question. Price was a regular customer, or rather, a regular presence, for he bought more on credit than he paid for, and had arrived at approximately 5:15 to negotiate the purchase of a box of Havana cigars. The negotiation had been protracted and somewhat heated, as Price's account was already overdue, and Arnott was disinclined to extend further credit. They had argued, compromised, and eventually settled terms, and Price had departed at roughly 6 o'clock with a box of cigars under his arm and a new debt on Arnott's ledger. "He was here the whole time?" I asked. "Every minute of it, Doctor. I couldn't get rid of the man. He sat in my back room and talked my ear half off about how the world had treated him unfairly, and I nodded and smiled and wished he would buy something or leave. He paused. "He's an unhappy man, Mr. Price, but he's not a violent one. Not in my experience." I thanked Arnott and returned to Baker Street to await Holmes. Price's alibi was solid. Whatever else the man might be, drunkard, blackmailer, author of threatening letters, he had not killed Sir Edmund Hale. Holmes returned in the late afternoon. He came through the door with the particular energy he displayed when a long day of research had yielded results. Not elation, precisely, but a kind of grim satisfaction, as though he had confirmed something he had hoped, for the sake of human nature, might not be true. He shed his coat, dropped into his chair, and accepted the whisky I poured him with a nod of thanks. Then he laid out what he had found. "Leonard Cray," he began. "Let us examine the man. He entered Sir Edmund Hale's service 13 years ago as a private secretary. Before that, he was employed as a junior clerk in the Southwark County Court, where he had worked for 8 years. By all accounts, he was competent, reliable, and well regarded. His salary at Southwark was modest, but adequate for a single man of simple habits." He paused and sipped his whisky. 13 years ago, he resigned his position at Southwark and accepted the post of private secretary to Sir Edmund Hale, who had recently retired from the High Court. The post carried a lower salary than his previous employment. Lower, Watson, not higher. A man uproots himself from an established career, leaves a court where he is known and respected, and takes a position of lesser pay in the household of a retired judge. Why? Admiration, I offered. Sir Edmund was a distinguished figure. Perhaps Cray wished to serve a man he respected. That is one possibility. Here is another. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper, notes he had taken at Somerset House. Thomas Cray, labourer, aged 27 at the time of his trial, charged with assault, a brutal attack upon a shopkeeper in Bermondsey, tried before the High Court. The presiding judge was Sir Edmund Hale. I felt something tighten in my chest. Thomas Cray, a relation of Leonard's? His elder brother. Thomas was convicted on the strength of a single eyewitness identification and sentenced to 10 years hard labour. He was sent to Pentonville Prison. Holmes's voice was level, factual, but I could hear the steel beneath it. He died there 2 years later, typhus fever. He was 29 years old. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled and settled in the grate. Leonard Cray entered Sir Edmund's service within months of his brother's death, Holmes continued. He left a career, accepted a reduction in salary, and attached himself to the man who had sentenced Thomas to the prison where he died. He has remained at Sir Edmund's side for 13 years. 13 years, Watson, fetching his tea, or organising his papers, walking beside him through the streets of London, listening to him speak of justice as though the words still had meaning in his mouth. You believe Cray has been planning this for 13 years? I believe Cray positioned himself 13 years ago, and that the question of whether he always intended to kill or whether the intention crystallized later is one that perhaps even Cray himself could not answer with certainty. But consider the facts. A man's brother is convicted, wrongly perhaps, or at the very least harshly, and dies in prison. The surviving brother does not rage. He does not threaten. He does not write letters or make scenes in public houses. Instead, he changes his life, quietly and completely, and places himself within arm's reach of the man he holds responsible. Holmes rose and stood before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. There is a curious kind of blindness, Watson, that affects us when we look at a man we believe to be faithful. We see the livery and miss the man inside it. Cray has been invisible for 13 years, invisible to Sir Edmund, invisible to the household, invisible to the police. His devotion was his camouflage. No one looks twice at a man who has been standing in the same spot for over a decade. But the timing, I said. If he's been at Sir Edmund's side for 13 years, why act now? What changed? That is the question upon which the entire case turns, and I believe the answer lies in Sir Edmund's study, specifically on a shelf where a leather-bound notebook should be, and is not. He told me then about the trial notebooks he had observed during our first visit to the Hale residence, the unbroken row of leather-bound volumes spanning 30 years of judicial service, one per year, each stamped with a gilt date on the spine, and the gap, a single volume's width, in the sequence that would correspond to the year of Thomas Creag's trial. I noted it on our first visit, but did not remark upon it. A missing book in a large collection is not, in itself, remarkable. But the timing is suggestive. If that notebook contained Sir Edmund's private notes from Thomas Creag's trial, his thoughts, his doubts, his reasoning, then its disappearance is not a matter of careless housekeeping. It is a matter of evidence. Evidence of what? Holmes looked at me steadily. Evidence, perhaps, that Sir Edmund knew something about the trial that he concealed, something that, if discovered by the brother of the convicted man, might transform 13 years of simmering grief into something far more dangerous. I sat with this for a long time. Outside, the February evening was drawing in, and the lamplighter was making his rounds along Baker Street, each gas flame blooming in the dusk like a small, defiant answer to the darkness. "Holmes," I said at last, "if Creagh is the killer, if this quiet, courteous man has been harbouring this purpose for 13 years, then he is perhaps the most patient and the most frightening murderer we have ever encountered." "He is certainly the most disciplined," said Holmes. "Most men who contemplate revenge burn hot and are spent. They act in passion and are caught in the aftermath. Creagh banked his fire and tended it like a man tending a furnace, feeding it just enough to keep it alive, never so much that it flared beyond his control. That requires a quality of will that is, in its way, almost admirable." He caught my expression and added, "I said almost, Watson. Let us not confuse admiration for the architecture with approval of the edifice." He knocked out his pipe and reached for his coat once more. "Tomorrow I return to the study. The missing notebook is the key. If I can establish that it was removed recently, and by whom, then the last piece of the motive falls into place, and after that, Watson, we shall need only the weapon. You have the ferrule mark, the stone dust, circumstantial, suggestive, not conclusive. I need the blade itself, or the man who made it. A weapon of that specificity was not purchased from a catalogue. It was commissioned, Watson, built to order by a craftsman who understood what he was making, even if he did not understand what it was for." He paused at the door and looked back at me. "We are close, Watson. I can feel it the way a sailor feels a change in the wind, not yet visible, but unmistakable. 2 more threads, and the knot is tied." He went out. I heard his step on the stair, quick and certain, and then the front door closing behind him. I sat alone by the fire for some time, thinking about a young man named Thomas Creagh, who had died of typhus in a prison cell, and about his brother, who had spent 13 years standing beside the man who put him there, and who had smiled and served and waited. It was, I reflected, one of the saddest stories I had ever been asked to help unravel, and it was not yet finished. Number 7, Chapter 7, What the Shelf Remembers. The morning of Monday the 17th brought 2 developments, one that Holmes had anticipated and one that he had not. The first arrived by way of Lestrade, who called at Baker Street before 9 o'clock, with the grudging air of a man delivering news that confirmed another man's prediction. His inquiries among the moneylenders of Pall Mall had borne fruit. A Mr. Solomon Isaacs, operating from a discreet first-floor office on a side street near St. James's Square, had confirmed that Captain Reginald Thorpe had visited him on the evening of February the 11th, arriving at approximately 6 o'clock and departing at 6:30. The purpose of the visit was the negotiation of a personal loan, the sum, the terms, and the collateral offered being matters that Isaacs declined to disclose, but that Thorpe, when confronted, admitted to with visible shame. "He's ruined," said Lestrade, dropping into a chair. "Debts to half the money-lenders in London. He left the club to beg for money, not to commit murder. The man could barely look me in the eye when he confessed it." "A soldier's pride is a fragile thing," said Holmes. "Thorpe would rather be suspected of murder than known to be bankrupt. It is a curious hierarchy of shame, but not an uncommon one." "So Thorpe is cleared?" "Of the murder? Yes. Of good judgment? No. But that is not a matter for Scotland Yard." Lestrade accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Hudson and sat brooding over it. He had now lost two of his principal suspects. Price to the tobacconist's alibi, Thorpe to the moneylender's confirmation, and his frustration was evident. "That leaves Lady Catherine," he said. "She had the most to gain. £40,000 and a dead husband. It's the oldest story in the world." "It is old," Holmes agreed. "But Lady Catherine did not wield the blade herself. Her maid's testimony places her at home, and whatever we may think of the maid's loyalty, we have no evidence to contradict her. If Lady Catherine is involved, she acted through an agent, and the nature of this crime, the precision, the intimacy, the proximity required, does not suggest a hired hand. This was done by someone who knew Sir Edmund's body, his habits, and his route with the familiarity of daily contact." Lestrade looked at Holmes sharply. "You have someone in mind." "I have a direction in mind. Give me another day, Inspector, and I may have rather more than that." The second development of the morning was unexpected. A constable arrived at Baker Street shortly after Lestrade's departure with a message from the Marylebone police station. A street vendor named Coggins had come forward to report that on the evening of the murder he had observed a thin, rough-looking man loitering near the entrance of the Athenaeum Club between approximately 4 and 5 o'clock. The man had been watching the door of the club with what Coggins described as a stare like a starving dog watching a butcher's window. When Sir Edmund and Cray had emerged, the man had followed them at a distance, heading south on Regent Street. Coggins had thought nothing of it at the time, but had come forward after reading of the murder in the newspapers. Lestrade, still present when the message arrived, seized upon this with renewed energy. Within 2 hours, the loitering man had been identified as Daniel Farrow, aged 41, recently released from Wandsworth Prison after serving 10 years of a sentence imposed by Sir Edmund Hale for a property crime. Farrow had been convicted of breaking into a warehouse in Southwark and assaulting a night watchman, a crime that, by the standards of the day, might have drawn 5 years. Sir Edmund had given him 10, citing the need to make an example of habitual offenders. Farrow had lost his wife, who had left him during his imprisonment, and his 2 children, who had been sent to a workhouse in Lambeth and subsequently dispersed into service. He was now living in a doss house in Whitechapel, penniless and alone. Farrow was brought to Scotland Yard that afternoon, and Holmes and I were present for the interview. He was a pitiful figure, gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with the grey skin and sunken eyes of a man who had spent a decade in poor light and worse food. His clothes hung on him. His hands, which were large and calloused, twisted ceaselessly in his lap. He was terrified. Lestrade questioned him directly. Had he followed Sir Edmund Hale on the evening of the 11th? Farrow denied it at first, then hedged, then contradicted himself, and finally, under the weight of Coggins's testimony and his own inability to construct a coherent lie, admitted the truth. "I followed him, yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been watching him for days, since I got out. I wanted to see him. I wanted to look him in the face and tell him what he'd done to me. 10 years. 10 years for breaking a window and shoving a man who grabbed me. My wife gone. My children gone. Everything gone." His hands clenched. "I wanted him to know." And did you confront him? Lestrade asked. No. The word came out flat and defeated. I followed them from the club, him and his man, the secretary. I kept back, maybe 50 yards, and the fog was thick and I could barely see them. Then I lost them. They went ahead of me in the crowd and I couldn't find them again. I stood there in the fog for a minute, maybe two, and then He stopped. His jaw worked. I lost my nerve. I turned around and went back to Whitechapel. I didn't see anything. I didn't do anything. I'm not that man, sir. I thought I was, but I'm not. Holmes, who had been leaning against the wall throughout the interview with his arms folded and his expression unreadable, spoke for the first time. Mr. Farrow, when you were following Sir Edmund, were you behind him or beside him? Farrow blinked. Behind? I was behind them. I wasn't going to walk up alongside him, was I? I stayed back. I didn't want the secretary to see me. And when you lost sight of them in the fog, at what point along Regent Street were you? I don't know exactly. Somewhere past the turning for Heddon Street. They were ahead of me, and the fog swallowed them. Holmes nodded. That is all I need to know. Thank you, Mr. Farrow. In the corridor outside, Lestrade was inclined to hold Farrow on suspicion. Holmes dissuaded him. This man followed his quarry from behind, Inspector. But the wound that killed Sir Edmund was delivered from the side, from the right side, by someone walking in step with him. Farrow was 50 yards back, in the fog, and lost sight of his target before the murder occurred. He is a hound that barked but did not bite. He has no alibi. He has no alibi because he was doing something he is ashamed of, following an old man through the fog, with a vague intention that evaporated the moment it met reality. Farrow is a broken man, Lestrade. His rage is real, but it is the rage of impotence, not the cold calculation that killed Sir Edmund Hale. Release him. He has suffered enough at the hands of the law. Lestrade, to his credit, did so. Holmes and I proceeded directly from Scotland Yard to the Hale residence. Lady Catherine, eager for the investigation to reach its conclusion, so that the estate might be settled, had given Holmes standing permission to examine the house, and we were admitted without difficulty. Cray was not present. The footman Briggs informed us that Mr. Cray had gone out on an errand and was not expected to return for several hours. Holmes received this news with a satisfaction he did not trouble to conceal. All the better, he murmured as we climbed the stairs to the study. I prefer to examine a man's secrets without the man looking over my shoulder. The study was as we had left it, orderly, quiet, smelling of leather and old paper. Holmes went directly to the shelf of trial notebooks and crouched before it, and he produced his lens and examined the row of volumes with minute attention, running the glass slowly along the spines, the shelf surface, and the wall behind the books. Here, he said. He pointed to a gap in the sequence, the width of a single volume between the notebooks for the years immediately before and after Thomas Cray's trial. You see the dust pattern, Watson? I looked. The shelf was lightly coated with the fine, even dust that accumulates in rooms where books are seldom disturbed. But in the gap, where the missing volume should have been, the dust told a different story. There was a faint rectangular impression on the shelf, the ghost of a book's base, and around it the dust was visibly disturbed. Smudges and streaks radiated outward from the impression, as though something had been lifted from the shelf and the surrounding dust had been displaced by the movement. The book was here recently, I said. Very recently. Dust of this consistency in a room with these ventilation patterns would begin to resettle and obscure these marks within a week to 10 days. The disturbance we see is fresh. I would estimate no more than a few days old. Holmes straightened. Someone removed this notebook from the shelf within the last week. Given that Sir Edmund was murdered on the 11th and today is the 17th, the timing is suggestive. Cray has had unrestricted access to this room for 13 years. He has been handling Sir Edmund's correspondence since the death. He could have removed the notebook at any point, but the dust tells us he did so recently. The question is whether he removed it before the murder or after. Holmes moved through the rest of the study with his customary thoroughness, examining desk drawers, correspondence files, and the contents of a small locked cabinet whose key he found in Sir Edmund's desk. The cabinet contained personal papers, letters, financial documents, a few photographs, but nothing that appeared to relate to old trials. As we left the house, Holmes was quiet. We walked for some time through the cold afternoon streets before he spoke. If Cray removed the notebook before the murder, it may have been the trigger, something in those pages that transformed years of patient proximity into action. If he removed it after, it was to destroy evidence of Sir Edmund's reasoning in the Thomas Cray trial. He paused. In either case, the notebook is the key, and I suspect it is not destroyed. A man who has nursed a grievance for 13 years does not destroy the proof of that grievance. He keeps it. It is his justification. That evening, Holmes sat in his chair for 3 hours without speaking. He smoked 2 pipes and drank nothing. I attempted conversation twice, and was met with silence so absolute that it constituted a wall. I retired to my room and read until the fire burned low. When I came down the following morning, Holmes was already dressed, and there was a light in his eyes that I recognized, the light of a man who has found his way through a maze and can see the exit ahead. "Watson," he said, "I need you to keep Lestrade occupied today. Take him to interview Lady Catherine again. Ask about the will, the marriage, anything that will hold his attention for a few hours. I have business at Somerset House, and then at Pentonville Prison, and I would prefer to conduct it without an inspector breathing down my collar." "What are you looking for?" he smiled, a rare, thin, not entirely pleasant smile. "A name, Watson, the one thing Mr. Cray has taken the most care to hide. Number 8, the brother's name." I did as Holmes asked and spent the better part of Tuesday the 18th in Lestrade's company, steering his attention toward Lady Catherine and Captain Thorpe with a series of questions that were, I confess, more theatrical than investigative. Lestrade, still convinced that the case would ultimately resolve itself into a conspiracy between the widow and her lover, was happy enough to revisit the territory. We interviewed Lady Catherine again. She was composed, impatient, and revealed nothing new, and called upon Thorpe at his lodgings, where we found him nursing his shame and a glass of brandy in roughly equal measure. Neither interview produced anything of value, which was precisely what Holmes had intended. My role was not to discover, but to distract. Holmes, meanwhile, had gone hunting. He told me the full account that evening, while seated in his chair with a sheaf of notes on his knee and a glass of whisky untouched on the table beside him. His voice was quiet and methodical, and I had the impression of a man laying the final stones of a structure he had been building for days, each one placed with care, each one load-bearing. "I began at Somerset House," he said. "The records of the Central Criminal Court for the year of Thomas Cray's trial are held there, and they are accessible to any member of the public with the patience to navigate the filing system and the courtesy to flatter the clerks. I had both." He had located the trial record without difficulty. Thomas Cray, labourer, aged 27, of Bermondsey, had been charged with the assault of one Harold Kemp, a shopkeeper, on the evening of March the 14th. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely upon the testimony of a single eyewitness, a Mrs. Agnes Pearl, a neighbour, who claimed to have seen Thomas Cray strike Kemp from behind in the alley beside Kemp's shop. There was no physical evidence connecting Thomas to the assault, no weapon recovered, and no confession. Thomas had maintained his innocence throughout. "The trial record is dry, as such records always are," said Holmes, "but certain details stand out. The defence argued that Mrs. Pearl's identification was unreliable. The alley was dark, the attack was sudden, and Pearl had a known personal grievance against the Cray family over a boundary dispute. The defence moved to exclude her testimony. The motion was denied by the presiding judge. Sir Edmund. He ruled that the identification was sufficiently credible to be put before the jury, and he directed the jury in terms that, while technically within the bounds of judicial propriety, left very little room for doubt. Thomas Cray was convicted and sentenced to 10 years hard labour. Holmes paused and consulted his notes. Now, here is the detail that matters, Watson. The trial record lists the defendant's next of kin. It is a standard entry: name, relationship, occupation. For Thomas Cray, the entry reads, Leonard Michael Cray, brother, clerk. He looked up at me. The firelight caught his features and made them sharp, almost severe. Leonard Michael Cray. Of the name on his employment papers with Sir Edmund, which I obtained from the household records during our visits, but you will recall that in every social context, introductions, visiting cards, casual conversation, Cray presents himself as Leonard Marsh. Marsh, I repeated, a different surname entirely. His mother's maiden name. I confirmed this through the birth registry at Somerset House. Leonard Michael Cray, born in Bermondsey, mother's maiden name Marsh. He has not changed his legal name. That would require a formal process and leave a paper trail. He has simply adopted his mother's name for daily use, a practice that is unusual but not illegal, and that serves very effectively to sever the visible connection between himself and his convicted brother. I sat with this for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle. So Sir Edmund's devoted secretary, the man who has stood at his side for 13 years, is the brother of a man Sir Edmund sent to prison, and Sir Edmund never knew. Sir Edmund had no reason to look. He presided over hundreds of trials. Thomas Cray was one defendant among a multitude, convicted and forgotten. The brother who came into his service years later bore a different name and presented himself with such self-effacing competence that no one, not Sir Edmund, not the household, and not the police, ever thought to question who he truly was. Holmes rose and moved to the window. Baker Street was quiet below, the gas lamps burning steadily in the cold night air. After Somerset House, I went to Pentonville, he continued. The prison records are less accessible than the court records, but a letter from Lestrade, which I obtained this morning before you woke, Watson, and for which I forged his signature with, I think, or commendable accuracy, opened doors that would otherwise have remained shut. I did not approve of the forgery, but I said nothing. There are moments in an investigation when Holmes's methods stray beyond the boundaries of strict legality, and I have learned that protesting them after the fact serves no purpose except to irritate him. Thomas Cray was received at Pentonville on June the 3rd, 15 years ago. He was assigned to the hard labour wing, oakum picking and the treadmill, and was described in the intake records as healthy, strong and uncooperative. He refused to accept the legitimacy of his conviction and made repeated applications for appeal, all of which were denied. Holmes's voice had taken on a quality I rarely heard from him, something quieter than anger, colder than sympathy. It was the voice he used when the facts of a case offended not his intellect but something deeper. 2 years into his sentence, a typhus outbreak swept through the prison. Thomas Cray contracted the disease and died on the 14th of September, 13 years ago. He was 29 years old. The prison chaplain's notes, which are kept separately from the administrative records and which I was permitted to examine, record that Thomas maintained his innocence to the end. The chaplain wrote, and I quote from memory, "The prisoner Cray died with great composure and expressed no bitterness toward any man save the judge who had condemned him. He asked that his brother be told he had kept his faith." The room was very still. The fire had burned low, and neither of us moved to tend it. The chaplain's notes also record that Leonard Cray visited his brother regularly throughout his imprisonment, every Saturday without exception, year from the week of Thomas's arrival to the week of his death. After the death, Leonard collected his brother's few possessions, a Bible, a letter, and a wooden comb. He signed the receipt, with his full legal name, Leonard Michael Cray. Holmes turned from the window and faced me. Within 3 months of Thomas's death, Leonard Cray had resigned his position at the Suffolk County Court, adopted his mother's maiden name for social purposes, and entered the service of Sir Edmund Hale. He has been there ever since. 13 years, 4,745 days, give or take, every one of them spent in the household of the man who destroyed his brother. I found that my hands were gripping the arms of my chair. I released them and said, with an effort at steadiness, "The patience of it, Holmes, the sheer, relentless patience." "It is extraordinary," Holmes agreed, "and it is, I think, the most important fact in this entire case. A man who acts in hot blood, who strikes in the moment of rage, is terrible but comprehensible. This is something else. This is a man who chose to live inside his own fury for 13 years, who shaped his entire existence around a single purpose, and who performed the role of loyal servant so convincingly that even the object of his hatred trusted him completely." He returned to his chair and sat heavily, as though the weight of what he had uncovered had settled upon him physically. "I have one more piece to find, Watson. The motive is established. The brother's death, the years of service, the proximity. The means are suggested, the walking stick, the ferrule, the wound characteristics. But I need the weapon confirmed. I need to find the man who made it. And if you cannot, then I shall confront Cray with what I have and trust that 13 years of suppressed truth will do the work that evidence alone cannot. A man who has carried this weight for so long may find, when the moment comes, that he is relieved to set it down." He was quiet for a time. I poured myself a whisky and poured a fresh one for Holmes, who accepted it this time and drank half of it in a single swallow. "There is something else," I said. "Something that has been troubling me. You said the missing notebook from the study was removed recently, within a few days of the murder. If Cray has been in that house for 13 years, why did he only just find it? Why not years ago?" Holmes nodded slowly. "A fair question, and one I have considered. Sir Edmund was a meticulous man. His study was his domain. While he was active and alert, he would have noticed if his notebooks had been disturbed. Cray could not have searched freely without risking discovery. But Sir Edmund was 67 years old and increasingly unwell. The household staff mentioned his declining energy, his afternoon naps, his growing reliance on Cray to manage his affairs. As Sir Edmund's vigilance waned, Cray's access expanded. I believe he has been searching for those notes, systematically, patiently, a drawer at a time, a shelf at a time, for months. And on the afternoon of February the 11th he found them. The day of the murder. The day of the murder. He found the notebook. He read Sir Edmund's private notes. And, whatever those notes contained, whatever admission or calculation or casual disregard for the truth they revealed, it was enough. 13 years of waiting ended that afternoon, Watson, not because the plan had reached its final stage, but because the last doubt had been removed. Cray knew at last, with certainty, that his brother had been condemned by a man who knew the conviction was unsound. And that evening, on the foggy pavement of Regent Street, he acted. Holmes set down his glass and stared into the dying fire. "Tomorrow I hunt for the craftsman, Watson. Somewhere in London there is a man who made a walking stick with a blade inside it, and that man will give us the last piece of this puzzle. After that, there is nothing left but the reckoning. #Chapter 9, the instrument maker of Clerkenwell. Clerkenwell has been, for as long as anyone can remember, London's quarter of precision. It is the district of watchmakers and opticians, of men who grind lenses and calibrate springs and work in metal so fine that the naked eye cannot distinguish their seams. The streets are narrow and the workshops are small, and behind their unremarkable frontages sit craftsmen whose hands possess a steadiness and a patience that the rest of the world has largely forgotten how to value. Holmes knew this world. He had frequented it during previous investigations. The affair of the doctored chronometer, the matter of the counterfeit sovereign dies, and he moved through its lanes and alleys with the familiarity of a man revisiting old ground. I accompanied him, though my contribution was limited to keeping pace with his long stride and offering encouraging nods to the succession of craftsmen he interviewed. His method was systematic. He had composed, on a sheet of foolscap the night before, a list of every workshop in Clerkenwell and its immediate surrounds that specialised in fine metal work, surgical instruments, or bespoke mechanical devices. The list ran to 11 names. We began at the northern end of St. John Street at 8:30 in the morning, and by noon we had visited 7 establishments and learned nothing. The craftsmen were cooperative for the most part. Holmes presented himself simply, a consulting detective investigating a matter of some importance, and described what he was looking for in general terms: a walking stick fitted with a concealed blade, spring-loaded, commissioned within the last 2 years. Several of the craftsmen recognised the concept. Sword sticks and cane weapons were not unknown, though they had fallen somewhat out of fashion. But none had made such a device recently, and none recognised the specific mechanism Holmes described. At the 8th establishment, a narrow, cluttered workshop on Seckford Street operated by a spectacle maker named Tull, we received our first useful lead. Tull had not made the device himself, but when Holmes described the spring-loaded mechanism in detail, the old man's eyes brightened with professional recognition. "That sounds like Hubbell's work," he said, polishing a lens on his apron. "Albert Hubbell, retired now, mostly, but he was the finest surgical instrument maker in London in his day. Made retractors and trocars for half the hospitals in the city. Clever hands, the cleverest I ever saw. He still takes private commissions from time to time, when the work interests him. Where can I find him? Bowling Green Lane, number 14, above the chandler's shop. Tell him Tull sent you. He owes me a favour." Number 14. Bowling Green Lane was a modest building of soot-darkened brick with a chandler's shop at street level and a steep, narrow staircase leading to the floors above. We climbed to the second floor and knocked at a door upon which a small brass plate read, A. Hubbell, Instruments. The man who opened it was small and elderly, 70 at least, I judged, with a fringe of white hair around a bald crown and a pair of magnifying spectacles pushed up on his forehead. His hands, which were the first thing I noticed, were extraordinary. Brown and weathered and spotted with age, but steady, utterly, preternaturally steady, with long, precise fingers that moved with the deliberation of a man who had spent a lifetime working in fractions of an inch. His workshop, visible behind him, was immaculate. Workbenches lined the walls, hung with tools arranged in meticulous order. Lathes, clamps, files, and burins occupied every surface, and at the centre of the room, beneath a broad window that admitted the pale February light, stood a single workbench with a magnifying lamp and a half-assembled mechanism that I could not identify. "Mr. Hubbell," said Holmes, "my name is Sherlock Holmes. I'm a consulting detective, and I require your assistance in a matter of considerable gravity. I was directed to you by your colleague, Mr. Tull." Hubbell studied Holmes with sharp, unhurried eyes, the eyes of a man accustomed to examining things closely before committing to an opinion. Then he stepped aside and gestured us in. "I know who you are, Mr. Holmes. I read the papers. Come in and tell me what you need." Holmes wasted no time. He described the weapon in precise terms. A walking stick, malacca, with a silver-banded handle, containing a concealed stiletto blade approximately 5 inches in length, deployed and retracted by a spring mechanism activated by a thumb press at the handle. The blade would be very narrow, a 1/4 inch or less, and of surgical steel, ground to extreme sharpness. Hubbell listened without interruption, His expression, which had been one of polite curiosity, changed as Holmes spoke. Not dramatically, but with a slow, deepening gravity that told me the description was striking a chord. When Holmes finished, Hubble was silent for a long moment. Then he rose, crossed to a cabinet at the far end of the workshop, and opened a drawer. He returned with a leather-bound ledger and set it on the workbench. 18 months ago, he said, approximately, a gentleman came to me with a commission. He opened the ledger and turned pages until he found the entry. Here, August of the year before last. A walking stick with a concealed blade. Spring-loaded deployment. Stiletto profile. Narrow, deep penetrating. The gentleman specified the blade width, the length, and the deployment force. He was very particular. "Describe him," said Holmes. "Medium height, slender, neat in his appearance, well dressed but not showy. Dark hair with some grey, quiet manner. Spoke precisely like a man accustomed to exactness. Polite. He did not give the impression of violence, Mr. Holmes. If he had, I would not have taken the commission." The description was cray in every particular. I glanced at Holmes, who showed no reaction. "What reason did he give for wanting such a device?" Holmes asked. "He said he was travelling abroad, to parts of Africa or the East, I don't recall which, and wished to carry a means of self-defence that would not be conspicuous. It is not an unusual request. I have made concealed weapons before. For travellers, for diplomatic couriers, see for gentlemen who walk in dangerous districts, the law does not prohibit it, provided the weapon is not carried with intent to harm." "And the mechanism itself, how does it function?" Hubble turned to a fresh page in his ledger, where a series of precise technical drawings illustrated the device. The level of detail was remarkable. Cross-sections, measurements, spring specifications, blade profiles, all rendered with the exacting clarity of a man who thought in diagrams. "The blade sits in a channel bored through the centre of the shaft," Hubble explained, tracing the drawing with one steady finger. "It is held in the retracted position by a leaf spring. The thumb press at the handle compresses the spring and allows the blade to extend through an aperture at the side of the stick, here, approximately 6 inches above the ferrule. A second press retracts it. The deployment is silent and requires only moderate thumb pressure, perhaps 8 pounds of force." "The aperture," said Holmes, "when the blade is retracted, is it visible?" "No. The aperture is fitted with a sliding brass collar that closes flush with the shaft when the blade is withdrawn. To a casual observer, the stick appears entirely ordinary." Holmes studied the drawings for a long time. Then he asked, "Mr. Hubble, would you be willing to testify in a court of law that you made this device and that the gentleman who commissioned it matches the description you have given me?" Hubble removed his magnifying spectacles and set them on the workbench. His face was very grave. "I read about the murder on Regent Street, Mr. Holmes. A judge stabbed with a narrow blade, and no one saw it happen. When you began describing the weapon, I knew why you had come." He paused. "I am an old man. I have made instruments all my life, tools for surgeons to save lives. If something I built was used to take one, I have a responsibility to say so. Yes, I will testify." Holmes thanked him, obtained copies of the technical drawings, and secured Hubble's agreement to make a formal statement at Scotland Yard the following day. We departed into the grey afternoon of Bowling Green Lane, and Holmes walked in silence for some time, the rolled drawings tucked beneath his arm. "We have it. Watson," he said at last, "every piece, the motive, a brother, wrongly convicted and dead in prison. The means, a weapon commissioned 18 months ago from one of the finest craftsmen in London. The opportunity, 13 years of daily proximity, culminating in a foggy evening on Regent Street. The evidence, the blood trail's direction, the wound characteristics, the ferrule scratch, the stone dust, the missing notebook, the name, and now the maker's testimony." He stopped walking and turned to face me. His expression was not one of triumph. It was something more complex, a mixture of professional satisfaction and a deeper, less comfortable recognition. This is the most complete circumstantial case I have ever assembled, Watson. Any jury in England would convict on half of it, and yet I find no pleasure in it. None at all. Because of the brother, I said. Because of the brother. Because of Thomas Cray, who died in a cell of a disease that flourishes in filth and overcrowding, convicted on the word of a single unreliable witness by a judge who cared more for his career than for the truth, because the man I am about to deliver to the hangman was, in a sense, made by the man he killed. He resumed walking. It is the chain of grief, Watson. Sir Edmund corrupted justice. Thomas died. Leonard became a murderer. And now the law will consume Leonard in its turn. Each link forged by the one before it. We reached Baker Street as the lamps were being lit. Holmes went directly to his desk and spent the remainder of the evening composing a detailed memorandum of the case, cross-referencing every clue, every date, every piece of evidence. He worked with a concentration that excluded all conversation, all food, and all awareness of my presence. At 11:30, he set down his pen and looked up. "I shall invite Mr. Cray to Baker Street tomorrow afternoon," he said, "under the pretext of discussing a detail of Sir Edmund's affairs. Lestrade will be in the next room, and you, Watson, will be in your chair with your revolver in your pocket. You expect violence?" "I expect a man at the end of a very long road. What he does when he reaches the end I cannot predict. But I have learned over many years that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation is not when a man has something to fight for, but when he has nothing left to lose." He rose, stretched, and reached for his violin. He played for an hour, something slow and melancholy that I did not recognize, and I sat and listened and thought about the morning to come. Chapter 10. The Reckoning on Baker Street. The arrangements were made with the quiet precision that Holmes brought to everything. Lestrade arrived at 2:00 and was installed in the adjoining bedroom with the door ajar. I took my usual chair by the fire. I had my revolver a familiar weight in the pocket of my jacket. Mrs. Hudson had been instructed to show the visitor up without delay and to remain downstairs. Holmes stood at the window for a time, looking down into Baker Street with his hands behind his back. He had not spoken since luncheon. There was a stillness about him that I had learned to recognize. Not calm, exactly, but the concentrated quiet of a man who has rehearsed every possible variation of what is to come, and has accepted that, like in the end, only one of them will occur. At 3:15, a cab drew up below. Holmes turned from the window. "He is here," he said, "and he has brought the stick." Cray entered the room with his customary composure, neat, pale, courteous, the Malacca walking stick in his right hand. He inclined his head to Holmes and to me, and accepted the chair that was offered him. He set the stick against the arm of the chair within easy reach, and folded his hands in his lap. "You wish to discuss a detail of Sir Edmund's affairs, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I am happy to assist in any way I can." "You are very good, Mr. Cray," said Holmes. He had taken the chair opposite, and his manner was easy, conversational, almost gentle. "I wanted to speak with you about Sir Edmund's career, his years on the bench. You served him for a long time, 13 years, I believe, and you must have come to know a great deal about his judicial history." "I knew him as well as anyone." "I think," said Cray, "perhaps better than most. He was a complex man, Mr. Holmes, admired by many, feared by some, and hated by a few. That is the nature of the profession. A judge makes enemies. It cannot be avoided." Holmes nodded. He let a silence develop, a calculated silence, neither hostile nor companionable, but weighted with expectation. Then he spoke again, and his tone shifted. It was still quiet, still measured, but there was something beneath it now. like the hum of a wire drawn taut. Sir Edmund presided over a great many trials during his career. Hundreds, I should think. Most were unremarkable, a few were notable, and one in particular, was tragic. Cray did not move. His hands remained folded. His eyes, which were fixed upon Holmes, did not blink. "I am speaking of the trial of Thomas Cray," said Holmes, "a labourer of Bermondsey, convicted of assault on the testimony of a single eyewitness, sentenced to 10 years hard labour by Sir Edmund Hale. Thomas Cray died of typhus in Pentonville Prison 2 years into his sentence. He was 29 years old." The room was very still. The fire shifted and sent a brief cascade of sparks up the chimney. Cray's hands had not moved, but I saw, and I'm certain Holmes saw, the faintest whitening of his knuckles. "An unfortunate case," said Cray. His voice was level. Sir Edmund spoke of it once or twice. He regarded it as a sound conviction. "Did he?" said Holmes. It was not a question. And yet the trial notebooks in his study, those meticulous leather-bound records of every case he tried, are complete for every year of his career save one. The volume for the year of Thomas Cray's trial is missing from the shelf. It was removed recently. The dust patterns confirm it. Cray said nothing. Holmes continued. He did not raise his voice. He did not accelerate. He laid each fact down with the unhurried deliberation of a man setting stones in a wall, and each stone was precisely placed, and each one bore weight. Thomas Cray's next of kin was listed in the court records as Leonard Michael Cray, brother, clerk. "You are Leonard Michael Cray. You have used your mother's maiden name, Marsh, in social context for 13 years, but your employment papers with Sir Edmund bear your legal name. You entered Sir Edmund's service within months of your brother's death. You left an established career at the Suffolk County Court, accepted a lower salary, and attached yourself to the man who had sentenced Thomas to the prison where he died." He paused. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the clock on the mantelpiece, the faint sounds of Baker Street below, the beating of my own heart. "You are Leonard Michael Cray," Holmes said again quietly. Thomas Cray was your brother. He was innocent, and Sir Edmund knew it. And you discovered the proof in the very study where you worked for 13 years. Cray was still for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The mask of the courteous secretary had not fallen. It had simply become transparent, and behind it was something older and harder, and infinitely more weary. "Did you find the notes?" he asked. His notes from the trial?" I deduced their existence from the gap on the shelf. I have not seen them. They are in my rooms, hidden beneath a loose board under the wardrobe. I could not destroy them. I tried. He paused. "They are in his own hand, Mr. Holmes. His own hand. He wrote that the identification witness was confused and contradictory. He wrote that her testimony would not withstand rigorous cross-examination. And then he wrote, in the margin, as an afterthought, that as though it were a matter of no more consequence than the weather, that the Lord Chancellor's office had expressed a desire for convictions in cases of street violence, and that a conviction in the Cray matter would be well received." His voice did not break. It did not tremble. It was flat and precise and empty, like a bell that has been struck so many times it no longer resonates. "My brother died in a cage," he said, "because a man in a wig wanted a promotion." Holmes said nothing. He let the words stand in the room, uncontested. After a moment, Cray continued. He spoke as a man speaks who has carried something for a very long time, and has arrived at last at the place where he may set it down. "I found the notebook on the afternoon of the 11th. I'd been searching for weeks, carefully, methodically, a shelf at a time, a drawer at a time. Sir Edmund's energy had been declining. He napped in the afternoons. I had time. And when I found it, when I read those notes, I understood at last what I had always suspected but could never prove. That Thomas was not merely the victim of an error. He was the victim of a choice. A deliberate, knowing, self-serving choice. He looked down at his hands, still folded in his lap. I had carried the walking stick for 18 months. I had commissioned it, and I had practiced with it, and I had told myself that the day might never come, that perhaps I could live out my years in his service and let the anger grow cold. But when I read those words in his own handwriting, his admission, his indifference, the coldness became something else, something very clear and very final. Holmes asked softly, "Will you tell me how it was done?" And Cray told him. He told it simply, without pride or self-pity, as though recounting the itinerary of a journey he had taken long ago. The walk from the club, the fog, the practiced motion, the thumb press, the brace of the ferrule, the single lateral thrust between the ribs, the blade retracting, Sir Edmund's gasp, his half-stumble, his bewildered look, Cray's voice, steady and solicitous. "Are you well, Sir Edmund?" And then the separation, Cray walking ahead into the fog, circling the block, returning to kneel beside the body with grief on his face that was, he said, not entirely false. "I did grieve," he said. "That is the thing no one will understand. I grieved for the man I had served, even as I killed the man who had destroyed my brother. They were the same man, Mr. Holmes, and I had known them both for 13 years, and neither knowledge cancelled the other." Holmes reached across the space between them. "The stick, Mr. Cray." There was a moment, brief, contained, but unmistakable, in which Cray's hand moved toward the walking stick, and I felt the muscles in my arm tighten around the shape of the revolver in my pocket. Holmes did not flinch. His hand remained extended, steady, open. Cray looked at the stick. He looked at Holmes. And then, with a motion that seemed to cost him something, some final reserve of will or defiance, he lifted the stick and placed it in Holmes's hand. "I built this over 13 years, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Every day beside that man, knowing what he had done. I was courteous. I was efficient. I fetched his tea and organised his papers, and listened to him talk about justice, as though he knew the meaning of the word. And I waited." He paused. "I am not sorry for what I did. I am sorry only that my brother is not here to know the truth was found." Holmes set the stick on the table between them. He pressed the thumb catch at the handle, and the blade emerged. 5 inches of polished steel, as narrow as a hatpin, bright as a needle, with a soft, precise click that was the only sound in the room. "Inspector," said Holmes. Lestrade entered from the adjoining room. Cray looked at him without surprise. He rose from his chair, straightened his waistcoat, and offered his wrists with the composure of a man who has completed a long and exhausting task, and wishes only to rest. "Leonard Michael Cray," said Lestrade. "I am arresting you for the murder of Sir Edmund Hale." Cray nodded once. He did not speak again. Lestrade led him from the room, and his footsteps descended the stairs with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who has nowhere left to go, and is in no hurry to get there. Holmes and I sat by the fire for a long time after they had gone. The walking stick lay on the table between us, the blade still extended, catching the firelight along its edge. Holmes had not spoken since the arrest. He sat with his chin upon his chest, his pipe unlit in his hand, his gaze turned inward. "One of the saddest cases we have encountered," I said at last. "Yes," said Holmes. He did not elaborate. I tried again. "Do you think a jury will show mercy?" "I think a jury will hear the story of Thomas Cray, and feel what we feel now, that the original sin was not Leonard's but Sir Edmund's. Whether that feeling translates into mercy or merely into a troubled conscience, I cannot predict. The law is a blunt instrument, Watson. It does not distinguish between a man who kills for greed and a man who kills for grief. It sees only the act. And you, what do you see? Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the walking stick and examined it one last time. The elegant shaft, the silver handle, the terrible hidden precision of the blade within. He retracted the stiletto with a press of his thumb, and the click of its return was like the closing of a chapter. "I see a chain," he said. "Justice perverted does not justify murder, Watson. It only creates a chain of grief that lengthens with each link. Thomas Cray was failed by the law, and now Leonard Cray will be consumed by it. And somewhere, in a workhouse or a servant's hall, Thomas Cray's ghost goes unavenged still, because vengeance is not justice, however much it may resemble it in the dark." He set the stick down and reached for his violin. He tuned it slowly, deliberately, and then began to play, something I had not heard before, a melody that was neither happy nor sad, but somewhere between the two, in that narrow country where beauty and sorrow share a border. I watched him for a time. Then I opened my notebook and uncapped my pen and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. I began the case record with the only title it could have: The Bloodstain on Regent Street.